The following is not meant to serve as medical advice. It is merely the story of my own journey and learning process. All the Unexpected, Season 3, Episode 6. What Young Children Need You to Know, Part 3. And so I have the absolute distinct pleasure and very full circle moment today of being joined by the author of What Young Children Need to Know, Bridget Miller. And she has so generously come on today to talk to us about her treasure of a book. So we're going to learn a little bit more about her. She is both parent and parenting expert and author, so quite the hyphenate there. And I look forward to hearing sort of how the book came to be, what she is doing, and then we'll talk about some of its most salient points. So welcome, Bridget.
Thank you, Kimberly. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
You're welcome. And so I did a little of a deep dive on your website, and you've got your about me. And so, like me, you are both parent and teacher, and former teacher, current parent, vice versa. So I'm curious, which came first? Were you a parent first or a teacher first?
Oh, I went to the schools first and taught everybody else's children. I was a teacher for close to 10 years before having my own two girls. And it was actually my husband who kept saying, so when are we going to have our own children? And I was a little bit on the hesitant side in the sense that I was getting so much of the love and joy and the hands-on at school. I was like, I don't really need this in a hurry. And then things shifted and I was like, okay, it's time. So we now have two girls and both are in their 20s. So it's been, literally 2 decades. And here we are.
Yeah, no, impressive. And so very similar. So that echoes my own journey in having taught probably about 18 years, I think, even before my own daughter was born. So I had started teaching just out of college. And I was probably, I was just 36 when she was born. So yeah, I had been teaching for quite a while in different environments. And so this book as a project, how did it come to be? How did it what was its genesis? Did you sort of think about it over the years, or was it just an idea? I'm very curious.
Well, it'll probably surprise you to know that it came from a place of enormous frustration and sadness, which when you read, you won't get that sense because I've written it in a way that it's hopefully insight and inspiration for parents. But the backstory to the why is, as both a teacher and a parent, I could see how misled parents and adults they sometimes are by their own beliefs or hand-me-down things that have happened to them as children. From what we see online and in social media, there's just so much information coming at parents. And I think that's the piece that was the sadness for me, is that there is so much information there that it dumbs us down as parents and as people, because we really do believe that we need a child development degree to be able to parent our children in a way that's going to benefit them. And that is absolutely not true. Information certainly helps, but as parents, we all have what we need, which is an intense love for our children and wanting the very best for them. So in terms of that, I think the frustration I was feeling is that so many parents would come to me as a parent consultant and ask me these things as if they were the only ones going through it, or that they were the ones who were doing something wrong. And that really saddened me because the stories were the same, like the things we were struggling with. Everybody was going through it, but maybe not everybody was talking about it. And so many people had been led astray by what they had Googled. And Google is a wonderful thing if you don't go down the rabbit hole and believe everything that you see. So it was that.
Yeah, so the idea of sort of the combination is an interesting combination of both isolation and overload. Right. So that you can, those two, it would seem like those two things are rather dichotomous, but in essence, they are actually working against and with each other in this space of parenting, right? So that we have this moment where you've got so much information that you're overloaded, but you also feel like you're the only person who's dealing with this, right? And that's, I think, a very important point. And so, yeah, I think it's an interesting genesis to say that it came from such a space of negativity to bring such positivity, right? But it's also, I think, very similar to life itself, right? and that
I just felt like I was sitting in this place where I had insight, and it was simple stuff, like ordinary, everyday kind of things, which don't need a long scientific explanation or research to back it up. Like intuitively, we know a lot more than we give ourselves credit for. And for me, it was this idea of if I can put little bits of information out in the world in a way that busy parents who are overwhelmed can just pick it up, read it in a way that it makes sense to them, everyday language, and then having read it, walk away with maybe a little bit of a shift in perception as to what they were seeing. Because one of the things I always go back to, and it's in the title of the book, it's when we see differently, then we do differently. So very often it's not about changing children's behavior. It's more about changing the way we are seeing their behavior. And when we can understand a little bit more about development and where these behaviors are coming from, we naturally seem to fall into step in terms of the what should I do? The big question. Everybody wants to know, tell me, what should I do?
Well, I love that you mentioned sort of these small, easily digestible moments of wisdom, right? And it's funny because I started interacting with the book before I knew it was a book, if that makes sense. And so your posts kept coming up, and these little kind of pieces of the book that you'd made into infographics, that were very internet easily digestible, just kept kind of coming up on my feed. And I was just like, oh, that's a great piece of wisdom, or that's a great, little moment. And it wasn't until one day that I kind of just, took another second, clicked on it, and realized this, no, wait, turns out this is all part of a book, right? And then I said, oh, okay. And then I got the book, and I will be honest, literally sat down and read it in close to one sitting. So it was about, from one afternoon that it came through the next morning. And I had read it from cover to cover because I am that voracious reader when I decide that I want to engage with something. And so to me, it was such serendipity in that sense, but it spoke to me in these little chunks for so many different occasions before I realized it was a thing. And so I think that's such one of the wonderful things about it is that it is in these very small, very digestible, contained chapters that each have the intention. And I love that because one of the intentions that I saw in your own list of intentions that I thought was beautiful was the idea to inspire parents to reconnect with their inner wisdom. And I think, you just addressed that it's such a beautiful idea. And it's so very uniquely empowering to tell people that, in this space of your child, you really are the expert.
Yeah. Yeah, which comes as a shock to a lot of parents. I mean, even in myself, yes, I've got the degrees, I've got the psychology degree, I've got the education degree, I've got the special education backing. I still cringe at the word expert because we might know stuff that we've been taught, but as people, we know more stuff about our own children than anybody else will ever know. And we are the ones who are the most invested in the long-term outcome. And that's where that thing comes in with the what should I do? We all ask that question from a place of wanting to take responsibility for our actions. But when we look too much outside of ourselves and expect answers to be given, we very often run ourselves into a ditch because our child might not respond in the way that a different child would. When you hear, oh, I did this and I did that and it worked, and we take it as a formula and we try and use it in a technique-y kind of way. If it doesn't work, we can go one of two places. We either go, oh my gosh, I'm doing everything wrong. I'm obviously not a good parent. Or we turn it around and we look at our children and we go, oh my gosh, it's not working on you. What's wrong with you? And that leads to a separation in relationship because there's nothing wrong with anyone. We just have to figure out our dance together.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really why it's in those short chapters, because we need a little reframe and then to get back into the trenches.
I think it's an interesting thing that you say, and I think it's a gift for those of us that were teachers before we were parents, because we do have that understanding that each and every child is different. Yes. And I tell people sometimes, who are only parents, right? And so they've only known the one child or the two or the three that they have. And they say, well, this is not working. And I said, I can teach the exact lesson. I can say, I presented it exactly the same to 4 different classes. And I used to teach ESL, so I would see 4 or 5, 6 different classes every day, right? So I would just sit there and say, I can teach the exact same lesson with the exact same plan and the exact same formula. And what happens in the class will be different. Who understands will be different. And 27 children might finally get it. And there's going to be the one that's just like, nope. And it's not there. And there's nothing flawed about what I've done. There's nothing flawed about what that child's done, but it's the deep understanding that they're going to be, as unique as snow that falls from the sky, right? That no 2 flakes are different. And so that, I think, is such an important piece of reflection in this, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think, Kimberly, the gift in this is, as teachers, we were probably one with 28 other children. Here we have fewer of our own. And it's a time thing as well. We have more time with them. I mean, we have jobs and we have places to go and houses to clean and things to do. But it's the little interactions that make the most difference. Mm-hmm. And I think people underestimate that because they're so busy feeling bad about getting out there and earning a living that, again, it's this place of, it's very disempowering when you're a parent who wants to give of you all, but you don't feel that you are. And when you can get the message, and I hope it comes through in my book, that you are not alone. Like, hopefully when people pick it up, it feels like a chat with a friend who understands. Because I have shared my own stories, and people often think, oh, well, if she knows what she knows, then she obviously didn't have to deal with whatever. And I'm like, no, this book comes from a place of having been there. Mm-hmm. It's very different when you are the parent 24/7. And as a teacher, I remember being a young teacher, and one of the parents asked me at a parent meeting, like, how can you do this if you don't have kids? Like, you don't really understand. And I was quite insulted. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I thought, what, you don't understand how hard I worked to get these degrees to show up and do this. But I wasn't the person who was being called at, midnight and 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. And it shifts completely. But when we show up with our hearts and the intention to figure this out, we will do it together.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting thing. It's that we have to hold space for how many directions and how many different places a parent's being pulled, right? And so that the idea that, there are so many other things that we have to do in a day that it can feel so overwhelming to try and do it all, quote unquote, right? There's that sort of do it all culture these days, and it's very all or nothing. But I think there's a moment, right, when we try so hard to strive for perfection that we lose a sort of value of the importance of the process, right? And so
the process is messy. Like the culture we live in, we see these beautifully curated images on Instagram, and everybody's wearing their matching outfits and it's all going good. And even the dog's got a bow tie. And you turn around and you look at your own house and it's like a tip. And you go, I'm not worthy. Like I'm falling short. And it can then lead us to this place where we want to maybe rush our children to catch up with what we think is the norm. And then that puts on a whole different layer of pressure, because we start trying to hurry children up to give us maybe what developmentally they're not able to give us yet.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a snowball effect. But when you slow it down and you wind it back and you go, okay, how can I just simplify things? That's when the shift really starts to happen.
Yeah, I actually ranted for about 35 minutes for just a single episode talking about what I called the imperfection of the internet world and what it's doing to parenting. And so I had such a moment about it, because I think it does such a disservice, right? Just when you've got everything so curated, right? And so just sort of divorced from what the reality of most people are, that you end up putting parents in a position where they feel that nothing is good enough, right? That it isn't the best, that it isn't this thing. And it's such a disservice to them, because that sense of self reflects in how they parent, how they show up for the child emotionally, how they translate their expectations, right? And I think that's a big part of what I took from the book, was having grace with oneself, right? And having grace with oneself as you stumble, and as you may not get it right, and that day that you do actually yell, and that you know that it doesn't happen, and you have to sort of go back and apologize. But also, not only that, highlighting how important it is for our children to see the flaws, to understand that it is a process of self, right?
And it's very much one of those things that one day is going to roll into the next and into the next. This is a process, you know. And one of the things I often say is that I really do believe our children are here to help us to grow up. You know, when we can show up with that awareness and vulnerability, that it's not all about us getting it right and teaching them everything they need to know in order to go into the world and be who they can be. We turn the light back in on ourselves and we go, oh my gosh, when my child triggers me, what is my lesson in this? Like, what are they helping me to learn? And that's when the growth and development within ourselves really starts to blossom. And then we find a bit of grace and compassion, self-compassion.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a beautiful thing. It was something that I think always informed my own teaching, in the sense that I always said I've learned as much from every student I've ever had as I think I've taught them, if not more, on certain occasions, right? And there's a sense of humility that has to come with that, right? And that's very counter to, like you said, these more traditional models of parenting, right? So these sort of inherited ideas that, you will do as I say, not as I do, right? That you are meant to, be seen, not heard, right? That these sort of very tried and untrue, we say tried and true, but actually tried and untrue,
Yes.
paradigms, right? And I think it's so important that we have the reflection to examine, are we upset at a child's behavior, or are we upset that we were never allowed to behave that way ourselves if we needed to?
Exactly that. But it has to come with a willingness and a vulnerability to see the other side. When we defend against what's going on within ourselves, we often put it onto our children.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
it's not coming from a place of malice or intention to be that way. It's almost like a triggered response. When we can't be vulnerable enough to feel our part in this, we make it about the other. And there's always that thing where when you point, there's three fingers pointing back,
Mm.
and we forget that. So it's showing up as best we can in every moment, knowing that we're here to get something out of it just as much as we're here to give.
I love this phrase that says, I need to express all my emotions. And so for you, what does that phrase translate into what a parent needs to know in that moment?
Well, I think the starting place for all of us is to recognize that emotions are going to come out in behavior. And when we can understand that behavior is communication, it positions us in a way to kind of read what's going on so that we can understand it a little bit and possibly even shift from reacting to responding. Because emotions, they need to move. We are creatures of emotion. And when we know that, we get much better at inviting all of their emotions, because as parents, people, teachers, everybody, we're very quick to welcome the joyful and the happy and the delightful emotions, but we're less tolerant of what we would term maybe the uglier emotions, which is the frustration and the yelling and the hitting and the kicking and the biting and all those things. But all of that makes up who the child is. We don't distinguish between good and bad. It's everything makes the whole.
And
So
I love what you said there for a second. I just want to circle back because you made a distinction between reaction and response. And so I want you to kind of break that down a little bit, because I think that's a really, really important point.
Well, when we're in a situation, we're very drawn into exactly what we see. And based on past experience, we will judge what we see in a split second. This is either acceptable or unacceptable. And that informs our behavior as adults. That's why if we don't think about what's happening and catch ourselves, we react, which means we yell back, or we threaten, or we do whatever it is that we feel moved to do because we're spooked by what we're seeing in front of us. So when we become more aware of what's happening and we pay attention in the moment, like, yes, the child is throwing themselves on the floor and kicking and screaming, rather than seeing them as, badly behaved and just trying to get attention and needing to be told how to behave. And we look at them and it takes a split second to go, oh my goodness, my child is having a really hard time here. They can't handle their emotions. They are being ruled by their emotions. This is not on purpose. They're not out to get us. They're certainly not trying to embarrass us in the supermarket or wherever it is. So it comes back to this place of awareness that we can make that shift. If all we do in that moment is go, oh my goodness, this is overwhelming for my child, and their behavior is telling me this, it shifts us from jumping on the behavior to make it stop, to rather respond to it from a place of maybe more understanding and, again, compassion. We can see the same behavior but completely transform how we deal with it based on what we are seeing and the story that we're telling ourselves about it.
I think that's a big piece. I think that's a huge understanding in that moment, right? That one of us, and this one in this situation is the parent, has the ability to control our emotions at this time, right? And that's such a huge piece, right? And so I think there's such a, and once again, it's not from a place of malice, it's not from a place of unkindness, right? But it is from just lack of understanding that only one of us actually has the sophistication, the emotional sophistication and the emotional development to control the outburst, right? To control the reaction, right? And understanding that that responsibility falls on you, and taking that step back, is, I guess, the response versus reaction space.
Yes, and it's very hard sometimes to be the parent and have that said to you. Because if you are very defended, you will instead look at the child and say, well, if they just change their behavior, I wouldn't feel like this. Like, their behavior makes me mad. Of course, I'm going to yell. And we as adults, hopefully, have the brain integration, which gives us the capacity to contain ourselves. But sometimes even we lose it. If we are too far gone, we know better, but it doesn't mean that we do better. Because we are creatures of emotion. If we are overwhelmed with frustration, even 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds, 90-year-olds act out. And this is the piece where we understand a little bit more about development and emotions. We can give so much more grace to our children because young children don't yet even have the brain integration to be able to feel one way and contain themselves more appropriately.
Yeah. I thought that was a great piece. And it was, I forgive me, I don't remember exactly what chapter it was in, but it was a line that said something along the lines of young children literally don't have the capability to hold opposing perspectives. And I thought that was such a moment because we find ourselves saying to them, why would you think this is a good idea? Or how could you possibly think that? How could you possibly? And I've had moments of saying that to seventh graders because it lasts. It's not, and I say to my husband sometimes, I'm like, it'll be, a moment of saying, because one of us was a teacher and one of us wasn't, right? And he'll say, well, I don't understand. I don't understand. And I said, there's times where I've looked at, a seventh grader and they've done something completely absurd. And I've said to them, why would you do that? And they're like, I don't know. And
they really don't know.
Exactly. And I said, they really don't. There's just that moment where the brain only held, I want to throw this thing and I want to see what happens when I throw it.
Thank you. That is so beautifully said. And do you know that all my years of formal education, no one explained it to me in these words. And it was only when I discovered Dr. Gordon Neufeld, who's a developmental psychologist here in Vancouver, and he put it in a way that I could get it, that this is about brain development. The left and the right hemisphere aren't even wired up yet for little people to hold these mixed feelings. Part of me is really, really mad and I want to scream, I hate you. And part of me really loves you and I don't want to insult you. Those are two opposing thoughts that cannot connect. Between the ages of 5 and 7 in the ideal world, that's when they start to get the capacity to part of me this and part of me that. But before that, young children can't even do it.
Oh, and also that's a great note that at 7, they're just starting. So that, it's going to be years and years of development after that before all of these actions totally make sense.
That's right.
And I've had the gift of teaching everything from preschool through 12th grade and even beyond. Yes. And so I say, there's moments at all different ages where you see this because it's still not quite there. And I think, you often hear the phrase, right, you should know better by now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in the moment, you do know better, but you can't actually act any better. If you are being overridden by your frustration, the logic's not there. Like children, people, everybody, we know better than we do a lot of the time. But we need to give younger children the grace because they can't actually help themselves. And they don't mean it in the way that we misread it. And this is a teeny little thing which we could spend 3 days talking about, but it completely transforms the way that we respond when they're acting out in this way and we go, oh, they're really struggling now. And it gets really tricky because when we see glimpses of this brain integration, sometimes they do act in the ways that we wanted them to, which misleads us the next time when they don't, because then we think they're acting out on purpose.
And you also can naturally feel a bit defeated, right?
Yeah.
You could also say, well, I thought we had this, right? I thought we'd covered this, right?
Yes, but we're going to have to do this again and again and again. And as adults, we know it. When we are tired, hungry, stressed, or sick, we are not at our best. That's when we snap over the smallest thing. And it's not because we're bad people. It's because we're frustrated. And in that moment, we couldn't contain ourselves. It's not an excuse. It's a reason.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, right? It's without judgment. This is the place of logic. We're saying, look, this is the actual physiological, psychological inability to do this thing. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it whatever? That's not the point. We're saying this, it is frankly what it is. I mean, it's also when you talk about, even the adult brain in trauma, right? When we go into fight or flight. And so that if you think about what sends a child into that, fight or flight mode. It's something a lot simpler most of the time. And that's actually a really good segue because I want to talk a little bit about the chapter that says lots of things are a big deal to me. And I want to talk about, the parent that says, I gave her the blue plate and not the red plate. And the entire day has been up in the air. How could something be that important?
Mm-hmm.
And I really just kind of want to talk about how we navigate as parents the understanding that something that small for a child really can be that important.
Well, I think that's again, it comes back to how we're seeing them. From an adult logic perspective, it doesn't matter which plate or cup you get. Like the blue one works just as well as the red one. Like it's a plate. But to a small person who lacks experience and perspective, their little mind had it set that they were going to get the red plate, and then they don't. They can't contain themselves in that moment. It's that absolute, it's the surprise of getting it. It's the disappointment of getting what they didn't want. It's all of that rolled into one. And it takes just a few seconds for them to go kaboom. And we've got a lot going on in our worlds. And we look at them and we think, really, like, do you have to be this difficult about the smallest thing? But the little things do matter to them because that is their world. They don't understand anything about what a big deal really is because that perspective isn't there. So their reactions are disproportionate to the situation from an adult's perspective, but to them it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I like to use the middle school example because I think one of the difficulties I find when you talk to parents and you explain these things, right, is that we don't really remember being 3, right?
No,
we can't, we have glimpses, but we don't remember what day to day felt like. But I said to a friend once, I said, but you kind of can remember 12, right? You can remember 14. And I said, do you remember being 12 and the boy you liked gave a Valentine to someone else and it wasn't you, and your entire world was over, and that was the only thing that mattered? In retrospect, at 40 years old, it seems absurd. It seems silly. I said, but the perspective of saying to a small person whose home is their entire world, right? Who's mourning, they don't remember a week ago in the perspective in the way that we feel like it feels yesterday. It feels like an eon ago, right? And so being able to sort of, I think, explain to parents sometimes in a way that they can understand. It's like, do you remember when something that feels incredibly trivial to you now felt life ending and life changing? This is what they feel like in that moment, right?
And there's another piece to this that we overlook, and that is that the smallest things get the biggest reactions. But more often than not, the reaction that's coming out isn't actually about the plate and the color. It's all the other frustrations of what hasn't worked that's stored up in the emotional system. Mummy went to work and she left me. I had to do whatever and I didn't really want to, and it made me sad. And I wasn't invited to sit in the circle on the mat in daycare, or I wasn't invited to that birthday party, or it could be a million different things, depending on the age of the child, what that would look like. But then one little thing goes wrong and it goes.
Mm-hmm.
And then as adults, we hone in on the plate. It's not about the red and it's not about, and we lose our minds. But what's happening is the emotion is moving because emotion has to move. What we do not express, we depress. And then we get sick is something that I often go back to. But any expression of emotion, if we understand that this frustration needs to come out, we can help them to move through it. And in that way, they reset their little emotional systems. So sometimes it's to do with a lack of perspective and experience, but sometimes it's just frustration looking for somewhere to release. It'll be like us, you walk into the house and the backpack's been left in the walkway again, and you stub your toe on the backpack and you lose your mind. And that's as an adult.
Yeah. It has nothing to do with the bag. It has to do with the 8 other,
the guy who cut you off in traffic, and then, the long lineup at the supermarket. Who knows? It's frustration upon frustration, and it's in the system, and it's cycling, and it's looking for an outlet. And that's when it comes out.
Well, I think an interesting piece is that, I say to people sometimes, I say, we almost have less grace for them than we do for ourselves at times, right? Mm-hmm. Because we have that moment, we stub our toe, we yell, and we say, oh, well, you have no idea the kind of day I had. Mm-hmm. Like, this is my last straw. But there isn't a perspective of the amount of things. I said, imagine being 2, and from the moment you wake up, someone tells you you're not big enough to do the stairs by your own. You can't, wear the sparkle dress you want to wear because it's winter. You can't just eat cookies because it's breakfast and you've got to eat this thing. So that by, 11 o'clock in the morning, someone has said no to every single thing that you have just intrinsically wanted to do. And you've lost it by the time we arrive at our proverbial plate, right? But we don't often show them that same grace. So while a big piece of this is showing ourselves grace and saying as parents, we have these moments and we have these things, but it's almost like, do we extend that same grace to children in many ways? And very often the answer is no.
Mm. Right. And it's not because we don't have it in us to give. It's in the moment we're overwhelmed ourselves.
We also, I think, once again, this inherited notion of that's not their place, right? Right. So there's the idea of, well, I'm the parent and you're the child, and you're meant to just do the things I tell you to do without complaint because that's how it is, right? And that's how it's always been. Mm-hmm. And I think that in itself gets so perpetuated, even when people are trying to step out of it, right? And even when there is a perspective of, changing the way you parent, and they are more gentle, and we're not punishing, and we're not, spanking, and we're not doing all these things, that inherent power dynamic is still very often enforced, right? Mm-hmm. And I actually I wrote an article about this recently, and I said, I have a lot of issues with a lot of traditional classroom management because I think it ignores the personhood of children. And I said, imagine you were in an office and you had a presentation due and you worked all night for it, and you woke up in the morning and you were so tired and you forgot it on the kitchen table. And then you got stuck in traffic and you were late to work, and you came in the office and your boss said, you're late, and you tried to explain, he wouldn't hear you out. Then the project was asked for, you didn't have the project, and before you knew it, your name was written on the board in red letters for the whole entire rest of the office to see, how you did the wrong thing.
That's right.
We would all agree that that's completely unacceptable. You'd be written up for a toxic workplace, right? You would, like all of these things that were said. And I said, but for some reason, we're okay with doing that in a classroom. Mm-hmm. And the big question I have is why?
Yes. Yes. And I think as parents, we have the opportunity to show up differently. Yeah. And to realize that this shift, it goes against a lot of what maybe we believe because of how we were raised ourselves. Mm-hmm. And you will get pushback from people who feel that you're threatening what always has been. And a big part of parenting in what we would maybe term to be a more gentle, respectful way is going to get pushback because it threatens the status quo. Like, it's much easier to tell a child off and put them in a timeout than it is to look at, okay, how did I handle that and how could I do this differently?
Mm-hmm. Have you encountered a lot of that resistance or enough of it? And how is it something that you navigate? Do you find people sort of railing against the things that you're telling them? Which,
you know what? Interestingly enough, not a lot of pushback in a very overt kind of way. Mm-hmm. I think it comes maybe more when parents hear what I have to say. It comes more from a place of curiosity as to the why. Why would you say that it doesn't work to put a child in timeout or ignore them? And when you have the ability to explain it from the child's perspective, in terms of the effect it's having on the child, that they, in terms of their development, they don't understand how a timeout would work, that because you didn't do this or you did do that, now you need to sit over there and think about what you've done, is wasted on a child who's highly alarmed. Like a child who has done something that they shouldn't have done and then gets sent away to think about what they've done is lost. Mm-hmm. They don't have the capacity to sit there and think about what they did wrong and how they'll change their ways and do better next time. They get sent away. It evokes their emotional system, and all they can think of is, what have I done? What do I need to do to get back into my parents' good graces? Mm-hmm. Because they are creatures of attachment. Mm-hmm. Children will change their behavior if they need to do it to scramble back to be seen, heard, and belong to us.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, and also just the technique of isolation, right? So we've decided, in international human rights communities that solitary confinement is, akin to torture for prisoners X amount of hours a day, but you'll put a child in the corner to face away from the entire class and sit by themselves. Mm-hmm. There's a stopgap in the logic.
There is, like, your brain actually short circuits. It's like, zzz, zzz. Like, how can that make sense? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Like, when you consider that our greatest need is togetherness, especially when we're young, our survival depends on it. Mm-hmm. So when you take away your physical presence or you ignore, so you go with the shunning, it's the same experience of facing separation. That's enormously, it evokes the emotional system in such a way that you are so spooked that eventually it overworks and you start blocking your emotions because it's too hard to feel. Mm. And I will have parents who come to me and they say, timeouts just don't work. Like, I can do whatever I like and he won't do it. And I'm like, well, good for him. Like, this is a time for you to learn your lesson. And I say this from a place of experience because back in the day, I mean, I had the degrees, I had all of that, but I also had a very strong-willed child who was allergic to timeout. Yeah. And thank goodness for that, because it was the biggest lesson of my life. And it is thanks to her that I can now sit here and say it backfires in a way that you cannot begin to imagine. Mm-hmm. And things like that do get pushback, make no mistake.
I would imagine. No, I mean, it was, I was the perpetual child who spoke too much in class and was sent into the hall. And I remember, being you remember first grade and second grade and third grade. And it got to the point where I was like, well, I kind of like being out there. I could just read a book and
I can do my thing.
Yeah, and so it got to the point where it's like, this didn't even feel like a punishment anymore, right? Because you start to say, and then you get a child who's just like, well, if I say this, they're gonna send me over there. And you underestimate the sort of ability for the child to understand that chain reaction part of it, because that they will pick up on rather quickly. But I want to just circle back to the piece you said about separation, because there's a great chapter towards the end of the book, and it says just, please don't disappear. And I think this is a big one, right? Because it's the school drop off and you sneak off, right? Or it's I have to go to work and you just say, okay, well, she's looking away, just leave now, right? And just please, let's talk to parents as to why we should not do this.
Yeah, so the whole idea, like, and again, I can speak as a preschool teacher because I did it for so many, many years. I can understand the thinking that if I just disappear because my child is busy with something else, that they won't even notice. As an adult, that maybe makes a little bit of sense. But from the child's perspective, and being the teacher who would observe it, this child would go in, the mom or dad would direct them, they would sit at a table and be doing a puzzle, and then the parent would sneak off. And when the child is finished, because remember, they're non-integrated, so their focus is only on what they're doing the puzzle, they finish what they're doing, or they want some help, and they look up for the person that they love the most in the whole world, and they're gone. It's a horrifying experience for a child. And that's, I think, the piece that we miss. Mm-hmm. From a parent's perspective, when you are in a rush and you do need to be somewhere, you do what you need to do. maybe without thinking about how it's impacting our children. And I say it because I sometimes was that mom, like desperate to get out of the door so I could go and do what I had to do. But it comes at a cost that possibly we don't realize. So it's not coming again from that place of malice. It's getting through as best we can. But when we know differently, we can do differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think that's such a big piece. And so it's interesting. So the impact and kind of talking about the impact of something and sort of one of the final things that I do want to talk about, because I think it's a very important piece, is the digital devices. And so the idea of the impact that lack of attention has on a child, and really sort of how kind of dire straits we are in the situation. And people say that I tend to be an alarmist about it, and we have been small screen free always, and we've been very sort of hyper vigilant about a lot of that in this house, because I've seen the difference in children over the last 20 years of teaching, right? And so but I want to hear your perspective. I want to hear why it was important for you to include that piece in this chapter, because it kind of does feel like an aside. A lot of the other chapters are all sort of based on these very kind of intangible things, right? And these emotional aspects. But this is a very concrete piece of the book. And I want to know why you chose to include that and what message is important for you with regards to that.
Yeah. So in terms of the digital devices, it's new to us. Like, it's relatively new to all of us. Like, we don't know, what is the long-term, the impact? And we'll figure that out one day when. But the important piece is that I'm not opposed to digital devices. My concern comes in, it's around what children are missing out on because they're on the digital device. It's not, either or, it's this and. Like, the important thing to recognize is when a child is on a digital device, that is where their focus is going. And that part is fine, but they're missing out on the heart connection and the human connection because their whole world becomes what's on the screen. And this is not just for children, it's for all of us. As adults too, we'll be on our phone and something will be happening there and we'll miss out on a lot. So it comes at a cost to relationship a lot of the time, because the person who's not being attended to experiences separation. And that, I think, is something that when you're the one on your phone, you don't realize. But the person who is trying to talk to you or make eye contact with you or whatever it is missing out. So, one of the, I would say, the dangers of the way social media and cell phones and all these things has worked against relationship is in the sense that we've almost used them as babysitters for the purpose of distraction. And again, it used to be the TV, but then you would plop your kid in front of the TV in the lounge or wherever, and you'd be doing what you were doing. This little device can go everywhere. Mm-hmm. And it's in the stroller, it's at the restaurant, it's everywhere. And that sounds really judgmental. But in the next breath, children are missing out on those human interactions. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, something we need to pay attention to. Devices in themselves are not bad. Like, in terms of an educational value, children do learn things. They learn matching and colors and numbers in a really fun way. And that side of things is great. But it mustn't be at the expense of playing with some blocks on the floor with mum, or kicking a ball in the backyard, or those human interaction pieces. Again, we could talk about it forever on all ages, but I would say to know that digital devices do take us away from humans around us. And when that happens, our emotional systems do get spooked.
And just because I am a bit of a hardliner about this, right? And and people will say, and it was funny because before my daughter was born, I would talk to other parents, or parents at the time, and not other parents, right? And they'd say, "Oh, well, wait, you just wait." Mm-hmm. And I'll say, "Well, I've driven across the United States of America 3 times.
Yeah.
Once with a small baby and twice with a 2.5-year-old. And at no point did anyone have a cell phone. And at no point did anyone have a screen, not for 30 seconds, 30 minutes, or 30 hours of that trip. And so it's a question of it is actually doable. So for all of the sort of naysayers out there, people might tell you, "Oh, well, Bridget, your children are older."
Yes, they are.
Right, exactly. And so as the person who's saying no, I'm going to sit here and take a bit of a hard line on this because it is entirely possible. And I had a moment, and it inspired me to kind of really deep dive into this topic in another episode that I did, because I was sitting around with a group of children, and they had to be, I think, 4th and 5th graders. And I said to them, "Draw me your dream house." And you remember when we were kids, if someone said that to you, that was like the greatest assignment you could possibly have, right? You put bedrooms, swimming pools, and elevators, and whatever, And they looked at me and they said, "Well, show me a picture on the phone."
Yes.
And I had a moment, and I said, "What are we losing in the feeling of boredom? What are we losing in the immediate gratification that our children are losing some of that imaginativeness, some of that creativity?" And that comes, like you said, from that human interaction. And it comes from that human exchange, and it comes from them sitting in a group together and saying, "Oh, I would put a skate ramp, and I would put this thing." And that's such a piece of it. And I just think that's a moment of reflection for parents, as the users and as the givers of devices, right? And so, yeah, I just kind of wanted your perspective.
There's another piece to that. The creativity, most definitely. There's a piece to that. But it wasn't actually until quite recently it was pointed out to me that when children are on devices and playing games, and they lose, when you have to stack whatever against the clock and you lose, that is a naturally frustrating experience, because you're trying to do something and you can't get it done, and then the time's out, and then you lose. When you're on a device, you can actually escape the feeling of futility of not being the winner by just pushing reset. So children are not really given the opportunity to sit in the feeling of, "Oh, I lost," and that's that an emotional component. They avoid that by pushing start again, start again, start again. And when we understand again a little bit about the emotional system, one of the pivotal pieces in growing up is being able to tolerate the discomfort of not being the winner, not, succeeding, not getting your way, not whatever, which you naturally got when you played outside and, you were kicking a ball with a friend and you didn't get the goal. It's a different experience. So that's just a little add-on. But to also say, okay.
No, continue your thought.
Oh, no, I was just going to go back to saying, the funny thing is that I would never say that I don't want my children to have devices. Like, yes, they're in their 20s now, so that is way beyond my control. But, in years gone by, they did have cell phones and things, or they did have, a video game or whatever else. And sometimes it served me very well to be able to say, "Go and play on Webkins." Like, just go and play on Webkins. And that was fine, because it was it was working for me. And that's why I would never say to parents, "Don't ever have devices." I would say, use them in a way that serves you both. Because we are the gatekeepers. We are the people who get to put these devices into our children's hands. So when we can do that with a little bit of awareness, like I was that horrible mom who didn't give my children cell phones back in the day when everybody else had them, Mom. Everybody's got one. And I'd like, yeah, but you don't. And I'm okay with that. And then it's an opportunity for the discussions as to the why. And the frustrations around, sometimes mom just says no, or dad says no, and I know everybody else is, but no. It's the futility in that as well. Of
Well, but then that's an interesting thing too, because this brings me back to the internet perfectionism, right? But there's a keeping up with the Joneses about it too. So that I think we've got an entire generation now of parents who are like, well, but I don't want to be the one mom who does it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't, and that comparison matters now in a way it didn't, you know? And I was raised by the mom who was like, all right, well, Susie's mom is not doing this well. Susie's mom doesn't live here. You know, and it's like there was no, you know, and if everybody was, you know, and the classic, if everybody was walking off a bridge, would you walk off it too? You know, but and you know, so some of these parenting holdovers aren't necessarily all bad, right? And so I think that's also a big thing. We don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater with regards to generational lessons that we've learned from parenting. There are some very valuable things.
Yes.
But at the same time, we have to decide, are we giving this phone just because everyone else has one and we don't want to be the parent that is the mean parent, right? Are we, you know, doing this thing because, well, you know, it's Christmas and I have to Instagram my elf too, right? You know, or whatever, you know, whatever the thing is. And that's an important piece because that takes a piece of self-reflection too, right?
Well, it certainly does. And I love how you use that example of I'll be the only mom who isn't. When that happens, we're experiencing separation because now the other moms are going to think something about us. And if we're doing that, that gets them to question themselves. And it just turns into this whole big soup where, again, we have to go back to our own integrity and decide for ourselves what are we willing to do or not.
Mm-hmm.
No one can tell us. And that's, I think, what feels so hard for some people, because if you would just tell me what to do, I'll do it. Mm-hmm. And I can't say what's right for you. And this argument of sooner is better, when it comes to devices, that isn't so. Mm-hmm. I mean, I got my first cell phone at, I don't know, 36 or whatever it is, and I figured it out pretty quickly. And every time a new model comes out and I get a new thing, I've got to learn it again. I didn't have a cell phone when I was 2, so I don't have the edge because I got it when I was younger. So that argument doesn't stand anymore. But a lot of parents are led astray by thinking, if I don't give my child the benefit of this technology when they're young, they're going to be lagging behind, which comes from a place of great caring.
No, and it does. And that's the thing. So it's being able to recognize the reason behind doing something without the recrimination. Mm-hmm. No one's faulting you for making this choice. No one's faulting you for even saying you did X, Y, and Z and you did timeouts for 5 years and now you're not going to do it anymore. And no one's sort of putting blame on you. We're saying that we as parents, just like our children, have the space to evolve, to learn, to grow. And that growth and evolution and that even change of philosophy or the way that we do things isn't, you know, an indictment of the former way we did it or of the former version of ourselves. And I think that's such a big piece of it, right? And so, you know, for the parents out there who are saying, well, I never did it this way and I don't know where would I even start, right? It's there's so much space for that to just be like, well, you try the next new thing. And it doesn't mean that you've done everything wrong. And it doesn't mean that it's doomed and now your child is doomed, right?
Oh, Kimberly, I really appreciate you bringing that up because I think that's become my new mission on the planet. Because like when I first started sharing this book came out of my original Facebook and Instagram, which was Look with Love, mm-hmm. which focused on more on the developmental side of things. And then once I'd written my book, I really shifted to looking at it from the parent perspective. And that's when I started Parenting with Intention. And I don't know which is where you found me because they're both out there. But Parenting with Intention comes very much from the space of going back to ourselves rather than looking at the child and what can I do to change my child's behavior. It comes from this place of what can I do as an individual. And I think that's when the big shift came in terms of questioning the way that I had done things. I mean, you've read my book, I share that I tried time out because I was a desperate mom and I needed to figure this out. And an expert told me that that was the way to do it. But every fiber of my being was saying, don't do it when I was doing it. And I tried to override that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the big shift that parents make. They think they need to go from being, authoritarian or disciplinarian or whatever to gentle and wishy-washy and woo-woo. That's not it. Mm-hmm. This is saying we all, no matter how we parent, come from the place of the best intention. But when our actions don't truly align with our intentions, that's when we do things that work against the relationship we're trying to have. So this is about disciplining or punishing or doing whatever and noticing how you feel in it. If this doesn't feel good to you, that's a sign, there must be another way.
Yeah. Now that you're describing it, it was definitely parenting with intention because it was all these little tidbits about me. And I'm reading this and I'm like, yeah, okay. So I do feel that. All right. That's why, when you were having these little sort of aha moments, even as someone who started very far down the journey. We weren't going to spank, we weren't going to punish, we weren't going to do screens, we believed in talking, we we were very far down the line of if we're going to say that they're sort of in these opposite corners, which they really aren't, is just what you're saying. But, in the scheme of timeout to, free range child, right? So somewhere in between the two, right? And so we were, very far down that line already, but it offered even more insight and it offered even more sort of grace for self in those hard moments where, I felt like I'd failed because I'd yelled, or I'd felt like I'd failed because, we hadn't tried X, Y, and Z before we did the next thing, right? And that's such a big piece. And I think it's such a beautiful mission. And I think that's a really good place for you to tell people how and where they can reach you. And so we'll put it on the screen, but we'll also put it there is the book that we've discussed this whole time. There'll be a link to the website and to purchase on the bottom of this episode for everyone to get easy to. But if someone wants to find you and wants to benefit further from this advice, how do they and where do they find you?
Well, I would certainly invite everybody to visit Parenting with Intention on Instagram. As you've said, it's little bits often, and it comes from my perspective. I'm not trying to tell anybody how they need to parent their children. It's even phrased as I. And the way that I've written them is to position parents in that place where they can feel possibly the same that I was feeling, and then to point to a direction of what we can do about it. Interestingly enough, the book that I'm busy writing at the moment is on parenting with intention. And
another book that's so exciting.
There's another book. Yeah. There's another book that's coming because people have embraced it so warmly. Like Look with Love, I love. It's great, but Parenting with Intention brings a different energy because it puts the focus back on the parents. And parents who want to take responsibility for themselves are loving it because it positions them in a place of going, okay, this is what I can do and this is why. Mm-hmm. So, what young children need you to know, it's available online. It's young children examples, but the content is relevant to all ages. But it's just such a pleasure that I can put these little bits out there, and the feedback I get just warms my heart because my favorite words, and I think you or your husband Josh said it on one of your recordings, was I hadn't seen it like that till now. Mm-hmm. Like when we can shift that way we see it, suddenly things happen. Yeah. It's quite amazing.
It was definitely Josh, and in his moments of and it was funny because the genesis of us having the conversation the way we did was me reading this book in a single digestible unit, as I had told you, and then kind of in his busy world being like, okay, so you want to know about this chapter and you want to know this thing, and we'd have these very informative discussions of me explaining the thing to him and him being like, oh, that makes so much more sense with response to what he was seeing and doing with our child. And so at some point he goes, stop. And I said, what? And he goes, no, you're going to tell me the rest on air. And so when you heard that conversation, he had never heard the chapters before. He had never heard me articulate, my reading of it and read it to him. And so that was all kind of a live moment of him ingesting the material for the first time, actually.
Oh, I really love hearing the background to that.
So that's how those episodes were born. And so he said, no, he goes, we're having this amazing conversation and I think it's going to be beneficial to parents. So stop telling me about it. We're going to do it on air. And that's how you get him just having these aha moments. I never thought it, because he literally had never heard it before that moment. So that piece of advice. Well, once again, the book is available to purchase. I am really excited about hearing that there's a new book coming. I thought I had read that online and I actually forgot that I had read that until you said that again. So I'm looking forward. Should we expect that sometime in the new year, or that's just a...
I wish I could say it was soon. My publisher keeps going, and I keep going, oh no, I had another thought and I have to just change this and change that. So hopefully the end of next year. Publishing is a really, really long timeline, but I'm not someone who can write, under duress. It's the sort of stuff that it shows up when it shows up, so it will be there when it's there. But until then, everything is on Instagram. Like, I can't stop doing that to do this. I do this and.
Okay.
So
yeah,
little bits.
Yeah. And so the @ is just parenting with intention on Instagram. The book, for our listeners, the title is so it's @ parenting with intention. The title of the book is What Young Children Need You to Know. And you can find sort of all of the information, right, also on your website, right? So which is
BridgetMiller.com. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for being here with us today. It's been such a pleasure. I do feel like we could probably talk for days on end with regards to each one of those topics. And so, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Bridget, for joining us today. It's been an incredibly enlightening episode. As always, All the Unexpected looks forward to your questions and your comments and your responses. We can be found on all platforms. We are also on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest even, at All the Unexpected, and at our website, one word, alltheunexpected.com. And so from our family to yours, thank you with love and light.